Now a selection from pianist and soprano Hope Briggs along with Ron Valentino. Ladies and gentlemen, it is time for King Conversations. Janice Edwards is an award-winning talk show host and executive producer of the television show Bay Area Vista and Signature Silicon Valley. A published author, Janice is the president of her media company, Edwards Unlimited. Please welcome Janice Edwards.
Hi. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. I'm excited to be here, and I'm really so thrilled because you are in for a treat today. We are celebrating Dr. King's vision, 50 years anniversary of that vision, and a trailblazer, a gentleman who really needs no introduction, but who has made history in many ways. We know him, of course, as the first African-American Speaker of the California State Assembly, the former mayor of San Francisco, but that just encapsulates a little bit of his global impact. So please join me in giving a warm Dr. King Day welcome to Willie Brown, the Honorable Willie Brown. Fondly known as the Mayor. Good to see you, sir.
Thank you.
How are you on this day?
I'm all right. I'm all right, as a matter of fact. I watched the president do his inaugural address. It was much better than his first inaugural address. He covered all the subjects that I thought he should have covered, and he did it in a very short time period. And what was really impressive was his wife and daughters showed up. And they're no longer daughters.
I know, they've grown, and they've done a really good job of shielding them from some of the publicity, but at the same time, they seem to be very grounded. A little bit bored when they first walked out, but then they saw a cousin and they were excited.
Yeah, that's great.
Yes, yes, it is an incredible day. And when you think back to that, when we think back to 1963, the 50th year anniversary of I Have a Dream, that was the year before you were entered into the State Assembly, but you had met Dr. King years before. Tell us about that first time meeting him, your impressions.
Well, you know, Martin, as everybody called him at that time, was very, very unusual. He was so far ahead of his time in his dealing with the issue of race in America and what we needed to do. He was thinking consensus building back then, when most of us were simply focused on kind of the narrowness of the issues. And he had been elevated, frankly, by performance in the 50s when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on that bus. And that process started, and Martin Luther King Jr. was the minister that was selected because he was a minister, as the other ministers said, had the least to lose. He was new and inexperienced and didn't have all the contacts, etc. And he was preaching a different kind of a response. And they selected him to be the leader. And for those of us at the college level and at the law school level, we were really impressed with that. And that's how the whole world of Andy and Martin and that whole crowd started.
Yes, it was an incredible time. You were born in Mineola, Texas, and at the time that you were a youth, there was mob violence that broke out and African Americans were not allowed to vote. So then when Dr. King began the movement that he was drafted into, as you refer to that, what were your thoughts about the outcome? Did you foresee any of what we are now experiencing at that time? What did you think would happen?
No, you fantasize about the potential for the presidency. You fantasize about running American Express. You fantasize about all the incredible things that are now a part of our everyday life in this country for people of color. But you never really had any precedent for making you believe it would happen. In those days, you read whatever was published, but it never carried any real decisive acknowledgement of something people of color were really doing. After all, we just started playing baseball. Yes. We Jackie had just, on the 10 years before that, become the first baseball player that was accepted in Major League Baseball. We were obviously still behind the 8 ball in almost every other category. We were literally still in this country very separate, very much not part of the main delivery system. We didn't have resources. We had no access to resources in order to get there. And so to think realistically about one day being in the White House, it truly was a dream.
Yes. When you decided to enter the political arena, what was the climate like? I'm sure you had a lot of people tell you that it would never happen. But what inspired you and who helped you as you moved forward?
Well, I was frankly, by the time I ran for public office for the first time in 1960, I ran for the county committee. It's just kind of a nothing gig, and I won it. But I won it because I was on a ticket made up of Phil Burton's choices. Phil Burton was then the political leader in this town. He had organized labor lined up behind him. He had senior citizens lined up behind him. He had the few Asians who could vote at that time and were voting lined up behind him. what he did was he put together a collection of people to run for that particular job. And we all got it because we were the most competitive. I graduated from that experience to run for public office for the California State Assembly in 1962. And I lost. It's the only election I ever lost. And I lost that election by less than, fewer than 1,000 votes. We had virtually nobody endorsing us. The International Longshoremen endorsed us. The International Longshoremen really worked to get me elected. But that was it. The rest of organized labor was still for the incumbent. The incumbent was an Irishman named Gaffney, who was a member of the Painters Union, and he had been a member of the Assembly for 22 years. Well, Phil Burton was a very brilliant guy. In the world of politics, you draw lines in what's called reapportionment to see where you might be able to run, i.e., if you could draw lines that reflected a greater population of African Americans in a district, you'd have a better shot at winning. Well, Phil had drawn lines for what is now the Fillmore and the Haight in that part of San Francisco, and that's where this incumbent actually was. However, he didn't ring doorbells. He didn't do any of the things that we now do. The black churches put together an operation where the black churches actually held fundraisers on Sundays after church on my behalf. And in those days, if you could, $700 was a lot of money for running for public office back in those days. And so the combination of all those things is what became the foundation for my ultimate success. However, it required me to work 24/7. I literally introduced myself to every voter in the district. I literally pushed to get every person who wasn't registered to vote. And then on election day, we went looking for bodies to show up, to cast a vote. And that's how we won.
Yes, that's a great strategy that I think that deserves applause because that's vision. And I think for a lot of young people here today, especially when you hear about working 24/7, sometimes it's hard to understand what it takes to keep going because, so you won that election, then you got to the assembly and talking about having to do consensus building. I'm sure everyone did not welcome you as the first African American.
Are you kidding me? Not only did they not welcome me, they didn't think I should have been there. They really mistreated me in every way. But it was no different than the mistreatment that was going on in America generally for black people. It was no different than what Dr. King and Ralph Abernathy and Andy Young and Jesse Jackson and that whole collection of warriors who were in the South. It was no different from what they were experiencing. But what we had was we had San Francisco. By then, we had John Burton, we had George Moscone, we had a fellow named Frank Brand, who's no longer with us. We had a fellow named Jack Morrison, who's no longer with us. We had a woman named Sue Bierman, who's no longer with us. We had a collection of people who really wanted to make the system work. And we actually dispatched people from here to go south to do what we were doing here, signing people up to vote. George Moscone and Terry Francois got on an airplane and went to Mississippi, risking their lives for purposes of signing people up to vote. A number of other people did similar kind of things, but it was a means by which we became the San Francisco representative, which got us just a little bit above just being black. Suddenly you had the business world of San Francisco, you had the artistic world of San Francisco, you had the educational world, you had the medical world of San Francisco, because after all, those are the issues that people deal with at the state level. Yes. And if I'm in the position where I'm the horse, they got to deal with me. And absolutely, that's how the process unfolded. So in Sacramento, where they didn't want not only did they not want me there because I was black, they didn't want me there because I came from San Francisco. As a matter of fact, it may have been worse that I came from San Francisco than black, because I think I generated more fear with the stamp of approval from San Francisco than I did the stamp of approval from black. They eventually came to understand that the black stamp of approval was far more deadly.
Absolutely. Now, at that time, Dr. King had given his I Have a Dream speech. Do you remember hearing that? And
Absolutely.
Where were you? What was the impact for you personally?
Well, you know, when the March on Washington was organized, it was really incredibly well organized. Every black organization in the country, every one of them was a component of that effort. Whether it was the NAACP, the Urban League, SNCC, CORE, didn't matter. Every organization in the country, every church, National Baptist Convention, every organization you can think of was a part of that effort. And it really was a gathering for the first time of everything that had occurred in Montgomery, everything that had occurred in Selma, everything that had occurred in all the other places, all of the combination of people who had been harmed or were about to be harmed. All of that was what fueled the March on Washington. It was an incredible experience. Dorothy Height from the National Council of Negro Women, or you just had, and the names that you had been reading about in Jet, the names that you had been reading about in Ebony, the names that you had been reading about. And in those days, we did have good national communications about black people. I couldn't wait to get Jet to take a look at it. It doesn't exist anymore, but I couldn't wait to get Jet so I could find out who did what to whom. And then Ebony, the first 2 pages of Ebony, of the first 3 pages, were the list of firsts in the country. If you were like the first banker, you were like the first gas station owner, you were like the first automobile. All those things were incredible.
So you were listed in there. Do you still have that Ebony?
Absolutely. Are you kidding me? I got everything. But all of that was part of what made the March on Washington so incredibly important. And King's speech, the most memorable of all the speeches made on that occasion, you got to know that, I don't know if you've ever been part of organizing a black rally or black anything else.
Yes.
But everybody wants to speak.
Yes.
Everybody wants to speak. And if they have raised some money to put it on, or if they have delivered some people, or they have to speak. There's no question. And everybody spoke. But everybody agreed nobody wanted to follow King. So he ended up having to be the last guy to speak. I mean, it was amazing. He was the last to speak. And it turned out his was single best of all the speeches, period. And the one that, till this day, is memorialized. I love when I occasionally will see one of the other people who spoke at that occasion. I'm a little nasty about it. I just say, I don't remember you.
Oh.
That's nasty. I don't remember your speech. But there was another thing. People treated that March on Washington, African Americans and many other people, treated it more favorable than they did the first inauguration of Barack Obama. More people spent their own dollars and what have you to get there in order to be there, to be a part of that scene, to do the march. And that's why it is so significant in the history today of changes in America, because for many people, it came out of that combination of people doing all the things that they did, plus King becoming, I think, probably the zenith of his message occurred at the March on Washington.
Yes, and when you mentioned that people for the first inauguration were not as unified as at that time. What are your thoughts about that? Do you feel that some people take the advances for granted in a way, even though they're still incredible milestones?
Well, what you have is, when the March on Washington occurred, we were all a people who knew that we were being discriminated against. We were people we knew that we were all being mistreated based on the color of our skin. Post the March on Washington, after the Voting Rights Act, after the Civil Rights Act, after the implementation of Brown versus the Board of Education, which was wiped out separate with equal facilities, after the Affirmative Action Program, after the Philadelphia Plan, after the 8A set-aside, you suddenly began to get an incredible array of people who would begin to evidence real success. You know, when Chenault became head of American Express, you know, he was still a contributor, but he wasn't an attendee.
Yeah.
He was busy running American Express. And the same goes for the people who were running many of the other major corporations in America. African Americans, frankly, had arrived. And so and you don't have the same level of displeasure being expressed every day of one's life if you're black as you did in 1963. Every day of your life, you experience being black. In this day and age, there are some days you don't experience being black because you're in charge. You're running the operation. And there's a difference. And so when Barack Obama, nobody was more proud of Barack Obama's success, I suspect, than all the people in this room, and then Dr. King would have been. But it was a new day. It was a new time. It was a new messenger who didn't have the same passion for the race issue only as King had expressed. So you got a whole different deal, and that's the deal you have today. You don't have what we had in '63 when we were all in the barrel together. Some of us have gotten out of the barrel.
When we think about this past election, the nastiness, the racism expressed, the threats against the president that would have been considered treason against another president, what are your thoughts about that and people saying we're more divided now than the country has been in the past?
Well, I don't think we're more divided now because I think the assumption of power by people of color makes a dramatic difference. The growth in the Latino community, of power base, I think there are now 31 members of Congress who are Latino, 43 or 44 who are African Americans. I think the acceleration of women to positions of power, I think that there is a dramatic change, and it comes primarily from the movement that Martin Luther King Jr. is really kind of the architect of.
Yes. When we talk about successful politicians, and today we're looking at a historic second, if you will, 2 African American females as supervisors, the first time since Doris Ward and Willie B. Kennedy were supervisors. What do you see as being significantly different in San Francisco politics at this time?
Well, when Willie Kennedy and Doris Ward were members of the Board of Supervisors, this town had probably 12–15% African Americans. The district that I represented for 31 years in the Assembly had no more than 10–12%, no, any less than 10–12%. This town is now down to about 4% African Americans, which means that there is a dramatic difference in the nature of the politics of the city. We have, frankly, an amount of clout in this city. We have Harlan Kelly runs PUC, and that's probably the biggest agency spending money to do anything in San Francisco through the contractual process. We've got his wife running the city as a chief administrative officer of this city, which is a very powerful position. That's a position that is second only to the mayor in terms of what can and cannot be done with that office. And then we have the two members of the Board of Supervisors, and then we have several agency heads that are people of color. Muhammad Nuru over at Public Works. We got Henry Alvarez, and they're trying to run him out of town. And I hope they don't succeed running public housing in San Francisco. So, in spite of the fact we only about 4 or 5%, we actually have a greater array of people holding power than we did 10, 15, 20 years ago. And it's because the people who were here 15, 20 years ago set the stage for all of what you currently see. That didn't happen by accident. All of what you currently see. And that's the role that African Americans have to play. King set the stage for what you see in many places now, including Barack Obama. And the fact that Barack Obama used King's Bible today as part of it is an acknowledgement of that foundation and that base. And so the difference is the skills and the ability to hold power, acquire power, and execute power. We've been able to do that in San Francisco very effectively. In some of the parts of the country, it's unfortunate, but we have bumped into a considerable amount of corruption, a considerable amount of people being accused of giving friends contracts and or taking back bribes, and where we've been in charge. We'll get over that. White people did that. In many cases, nobody said anything about it. But black people are still in that horrible position in this country of having to be better than any of their contemporaries, any of their associates. They cannot do any of the things that other people do. The rules have to be mastered by us. They have to be obeyed by us. Got to be restricted in how those rules are obeyed. And believe me, as power is being let, there is no question in my mind that 2018, we could be looking at Kamala Harris as the governor of the state of California. When Jerry Brown leaves. Jerry Brown leaves, Kamala Harris would be the most natural for all the reasons, because of her own talent, because of her skillful maneuvering of the prosecutory process in San Francisco, and now the lawyer for the state of California, for her ability to do outreach with women of color and not of color, for her incredible presence on the national scene. All that gives us a piece of power beyond our numbers. And that's where we have to do today. If Dr. King was alive today, he would not be talking about black numbers. He would be talking about the use of all of the techniques of power, potentially, in order to acquire power and to discharge power, and to do so with enthusiasm as it relates to African Americans.
Yes, and integrity with that. And the consensus building, when we look around, because we're focusing obviously on African Americans because of Dr. King's vision, but it was a vision of brotherhood, and that's something that certainly you see within the Bay Area that you had a great hand within the city.
Well, you know, it's kind of amusing. I heard today the president, and he said, he talked about gays being entitled to the same civil rights protections as other people who wish civil rights protection. Miss Edwards, it was 1969. Just think about it. It was 1969 when I introduced the first bill on behalf of gay rights. I got condemned like you wouldn't believe it. Just think of how long ago that was. Just think of how long ago that was. But I was fully conscious that you can't discriminate against people because of the fact that they may be gay or lesbians. You know, you just can't do it. And back in '69, I was focused on that. Early on, I thought it absolutely horrible of what was being done. At that time, I only thought about Mexicans. I didn't think about Latinos. I called them Mexicans. What was being done to Mexicans, particularly since I came from Texas and observed it. And it was always because they allegedly were not citizens. So I was doing immigrant rights stuff back then. King was identical in every aspect of his utterances. You don't ever recall him leaving anybody out when he talked about the need to take care of it. To the extent we do that, we enhance ourselves because African Americans know the technique of organizing to overcome discrimination and bigotry. Many of our friends who are exposed, like gays and lesbians and Latinos, they don't have any experience of fighting all their lives to do that. We were here in this country, a hostile location. They were in fairly comfortable quarters in the country where their language was common, etc. And so when they arrived here, they can't believe how awful it really is, and they're just not first equipped to identify as quickly as not a soul out there that doesn't have the ability, without any words, to know when somebody is messing around with them because they're black.
Yes.
We all have it. It's years and years and years. It's a part of our culture. Well, the immigrants can't understand why anybody would be after them because they have a different sounding language. Well, we literally are the people that can offer them the path to ultimate freedom, the same path we've had to take all of our lives, the same path that King spoke so eloquently about, and that's how we build the consensus. We can very easily do it. And I got to tell you, back to '69, my church was Jones Methodist Church, and I went to church a Sunday, so it is Jones Methodist. It is Jones Methodist.
It is.
I went to church. I went back to church. That was one of my students at church. I was the MYF director at Jones Methodist Church, and he was one of my students, one of my successful students. At any rate, I went back to church, and Boswell was the pastor. He had gotten a call because the state of California at the legislative level has got these churches that have lobbyists. And one of the preacher lobbyists had called Boswell to say, you got a problem in your church. You got a young man who's a member of the assembly that is trying to violate the Christian rules by giving people who are lesbian and gay and homosexuals equal benefits and equal opportunities. And that's the Lord wouldn't approve of that. Apostle told him, well, maybe you and I are not talking to the same Lord. If Brother Brown is doing that, Brother Brown is doing what Brother Brown believes he needs to do, driven by his God, period. And so my church stood by me. The black churches stood by me. They were not as enthusiastic as I would have loved to have them be, or not as enthusiastic as they are today. But they were centerpiece in accepting my proposed leadership. So we are literally equipped to be the change artists. And that's what the president talked about in his speech today. He went through how equal pay benefit for women, protection of children. We've been doing that all of our lives. As a matter of fact, we relied upon women making the money.
Now, what gave you that vision so many years ago? You talk about Dr. King, but what helped you have the courage to take these stands when you faced the opposition that you did?
Well, I guess I'm just not very bright. I never even thought about the opposition. I never measured the opposition. I always just think that in the public policy arena, if you do what you believe to be the right thing to do, it becomes the best political shield for your survival. And that's been the cornerstone of and it offends sometimes some of my friends. They get upset because, well, you can't do that. Well, let me ask you, is this what we should be doing? And most will say, yes, but it's just not time. If we should be doing it, the young man just said earlier, if you should be doing it, that's what you ought to do. Not what somebody else thinks.
And let your conscience be your guide, you know.
Yeah, well, I was raised by a grandmother, Anna Lee Collins. She had 4 boys and 1 girl. The girl was my mother. And there was no place to work in this little town where I was born and raised. My mother had to go off to Dallas, and she lived in what they call service. She lived up over the garage at some white person's house, whom she was the maid and the cook for. And she stayed there 5 days a week. She came home on weekends. Her mother raised her children. And her mother was a real, practical, tough old woman. She figured out how if white people thought she was crazy, they wouldn't mess with her. And she taught all of the kids the same way. She said, if they think, yeah, that boy's crazy, that's the end of it. You're exempt. And my grandmother was funny as all hell. I go to the store with her, Spade store, occasionally with her, and she said, Mr. Spades, how much you gonna take for that roast? And he'd say, well, Annie, I'm gonna take $5 for that. She said, that's probably the only way you could get it too, is to take it. She was really tough. She was one tough old woman.
Well, that's where you learned your skills of negotiation, no doubt.
I can tell you, she was one tough old woman. And I loved her. She store with her, Spade store, occasionally with her, and she said, Mr. Spades, how much you gonna take for that roast? And he'd say, well, Annie, I'm gonna take $5 for that. She said, that's probably the only way you could get it too, is to take it. She was really tough. She was one tough old woman.
Well, that's where you learned your skills of negotiation, no doubt.
I can tell you, she was one tough old woman. And I loved her. She had strict orders. Every child had a job, and you had to do your job. Every child had to make a certain grade, and if you didn't make a certain grade, there was a whipping.
Yes, we all remember those days.
There was no such thing as 911.
It was just
The Child Protective Service, no way.
and vision and all of those things that she instilled in you. And clearly, your vision has led us well, and it's been such an
In later life, just before my grandmother died, all these new things had come up. And about, people calling authorities to say when you do something to a kid. And so my grandmother said to me one day, she said, what's homicide? I heard you use that word. I said, that's when somebody has died. She said, that's what would happen if somebody called authorities on me.
Wow. Amazing. An incredible woman, and clearly she instilled such an incredible spirit in you. And I'm so glad you shared that with us today, as well as your vision and your memories of Dr. King. And thank you for all that you have given and continue to give our Bay Area. We can talk on about your mentorship and your institute, but we thank you for spending the time today in this King conversation, and thank you.
Thank you.
Give it up for Janice Edwards and the Honorable Willie Brown. And now another selection from Hope Briggs, along with Ron Valentino. author,